I want to begin this morning by showing you a picture. This is the dump in Guatemala City. The first time that Jill and I were there, we were in our mid-20s. We'd only been married maybe a couple of years, and the impact of being there is still with me today. That is to say, it has affected me in a very profound way. So the sights and the smells, certainly something that was way outside of my comfort zone at the time, and in many ways is still way outside of my comfort zone to this day. But having stepped into that space, I was really forever changed. And what strikes you in being a place like this is not just the sights, but also the smells. It's kind of like an assault in every way on your senses. I stepped out of the car, and as we're sort of unloading there on the outskirts of this place, you're immediately struck with this smell that it is like sewage. And then, of course, the sight of people that are essentially living off of the garbage of impoverished people. And as you can see in the picture, this is the way in which some people attempt to make their living. They're scavenging, finding things, and hoping to sell them just to make, a few bucks. I mean, the fact of the matter is, a little over half of the world's population lives on less than $2 a day. The other engaging thing about this place is that there are many children that live here. And you'll see them carrying sticks. And the sticks are meant to beat the buzzards and the vultures off of whatever rotting food is there, because that's actually competition for their next meal. And it's not uncommon for these little kids to sometimes get rolled up on by these big yellow dump trucks. Kids are valuable because they're nimble and they can move quickly and pick trash easily. And so it's just one of those places where there's this overwhelming sense of darkness that kind of sets in, and you begin to ask yourself, what can I do? No. What must I do? And so ever since that time, Jill and I have been sponsoring kids in impoverished areas of Latin America, giving them basic things: food, clean water, shelter, and education, and best of all, the gospel of Jesus Christ, which brings hope. There was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed reporter that visited this place many, many years ago, and she was a Christian, and she was so moved by what she saw, she stayed there and started an orphanage, Casita Ben Hameen, and it's still there to this day. And so this is where many of the kids now find a place to eat and a little bit of shelter, and they get exposed to the Word of God. And so really today is part 2 that we've titled How to Have a Meaningful Life, and I'm absolutely convinced that there is no way to have a meaningful life without having a heart of compassion. Last week we focused on one verse, which is, you're like, oh, that was really unusual. Jason usually covers about 50. Last week it was just one verse, Ephesians 2:10, where we learned that we were created for what? Good works. Those good works find their motivation deep within your heart. And I don't know about you, but it's very easy for me to reach out to those who are like me. It's very easy for me to like those who like me in return. It's much more difficult to step into that space where those live day in and day out, whom the Bible describes as the least of these. And yet, we know that from the life of Jesus, this is where he spent most of his time, people that are born into very difficult circumstances. So I think part of the challenge for us where we are is that, we don't fully understand what it means to be compassionate. And so here's a dictionary's definition from the New Oxford American Dictionary. Defines compassion in this way: a sympathetic pity and concern for the sufferings or misfortunes of others. So some key words there: sympathy, pity, and concern for the welfare of others. But in reality, this definition falls way short. It's completely lacking, because the problem is that it doesn't equate the feeling with any action. And if there's no action behind the feeling, what does it matter? I have good intentions. Our intentions don't count. They don't. You can have your wife. It's your anniversary. And you say, oh, it's my anniversary. Well, you know what? I'll just communicate to my wife. I intended to buy you something. I intended to remember. How's that going to work out for you? Intentions really don't matter. It's the action. So that definition just falls flat for me. And so maybe there's some meaning behind the word itself. The word compassion is a compound word made up of two Latin words, calm meaning with, and pati meaning to suffer with someone. It's the idea that you would sort of walk in their shoes and experience what they experience. And that gets us closer. That sort of relates compassion as empathy. But again, that also falls short of the way in which the Bible describes compassion. Compassion is a feeling, moves you toward empathy, that causes you to act in a way that alleviates suffering that's around you. In that sense, compassion from a Christian perspective is the tangible way in which we show love toward others and fulfill Jesus' words. The world will know that you're my disciples by the love that you have for one another, not just one another, but for those even outside this room. So I love what author Frederick Buechner says as he describes compassion in this way. Compassion is sometimes the fatal capacity. A fatal capacity, as if you could do nothing else, for feeling what it is like to live inside somebody else's skin. It is the knowledge, and this is really good, it is the knowledge that there can never really be any peace and joy for me until there is peace and joy for you too. The reason I love this explanation is because this describes our God so well. You know, there's this beautiful verse in Hebrews chapter 2 where it says that Jesus endured the cross. Why? Because of the joy that was set before him. He despised the shame. We've talked about this before. The crucifixion was not only excruciatingly painful, but very often you're up there naked or mostly naked, and you were just on display. And it was so shameful. It was so demeaning. And Jesus, this text tells us that Jesus despised it. To despise something is to count it as worthless. It's worthless. It means nothing to me, this shame. Why? For the joy set before him. What is that joy? You. You are his joy. So there's this profound sense that God could not experience the fullness of his own joy because he saw the condition of humanity. He's like, my joy can't be complete until they have the opportunity to respond to me and experience joy. And so God moved. Consider these verses, Psalm 51. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion. And what does the compassion of God do? Blot out my transgressions. Psalm 86, but you, Lord, are a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Psalm 116, the Lord is gracious and righteous, and our God is full of compassion. The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and rich in love. The Lord is good to all. He has compassion on all he has made. I really hope that you see the compassion of God toward you. And let me tell you why that's so important. Because if you don't believe you've received compassion, you're going to be far less likely to bestow compassion on others. You know, when you receive that, have you ever had somebody treat you so well in spite of what you've done and who you are? This is God toward you. And that becomes such a motivating factor for you to do the same to others. And so when Jesus was walking the planet some 2,000 years ago, he gave us many, many examples of what a compassionate life looks like. Jesus was constantly bestowing passion on others. So I want us to look at a couple of examples. We're going to start in Matthew chapter 20. Jesus has been traveling, teaching with his disciples. We read this, verse 29, and as they went, that refers to Jesus and his disciples, as they went out of Jericho, a great crowd followed him. So there's a lot there just in that sense. Jesus, his popularity is really, Jesus is the man. People want to be around him. He's doing miraculous things. It's like the Jesus show for a lot of people, and they're into the signs and wonders. At one point, Jesus will say, unless you drink my blood and eat my flesh, you have nothing to do with me. And people are like, what? That's weird. And what he's saying is, I'm not just a part of your life. It's just consume me. It's like you digest me. Make me a part of all that you are. And people are like, yeah, we were down for the miracles and the signs and the wonders and the free lunch. Great. But now he's getting a little too deep, and many of them leave. But at this point, his popularity is at an all-time high. You could say that Jesus is extremely busy. His calendar is very full. Everybody wants something from him. By the way, busyness is a great enemy of compassion. I'm too busy to deal with that. How many times do we ignore the needs that are around us? Someone else will take care of it. Someone who has more time than I do. Someone who has more resources than I do. And behold, there were two blind men sitting by the roadside. And when they heard that Jesus was passing by, they cried out, Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. Son of David. It appears that these blind men see Jesus for who he really is. Son of David is a title, a messianic title. They recognize him as the Messiah. They cry out to him. Now they're sitting by the side of the road. Why? Because this is how they survive. They can't have jobs. Understand too that back in the day, if you were this way, watch this now. Many people believe that you are in this condition because you had done something to deserve it. Remember with the man who's got some problems, and the disciples say, who sinned, this guy or his parents, right? What did he do to bring this on himself? And so as a result of that, many people would be like, that's your problem. You did this to yourself. So here they are, two blind men, they're together. They're by the road because that's where people travel. They're begging, asking for money because that's how they survive. And by the way, this is what suffering people do. They cry out. They cry out. If you and I aren't hearing the sufferings of people, then we're probably not listening. Because the reality is, we have people in our lives that God, I believe, places there for us to be a blessing to, but because we're not listening, we're not acting. And especially those who become marginalized by society, their voices become very small. And no one wants to hear from them. And have you ever tried to speak up and nobody listens to you? And you're completely ignored? There's a word used to describe that. That's dehumanizing. That's dehumanizing. To dehumanize someone is to rob them of what it means to be a human, to recognize their humanity. And so when you show compassion to people, there's so much more there. It's so much richer than you realize. You're humanizing them. You're giving them more than sort of what even a basic physical need might be met. You're actually giving them the gift of honor and dignity. You're humanizing them. You're helping them understand that they are created in the image of God just like you, and therefore worthy of respect, honor, and dignity. And Jesus gives us this example. We'll take a side tangent in Matthew chapter 8. Verse 1 says, when Jesus came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him, and behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him. You get down on your knees, that's a posture of humility. When's the last time you bowed down before somebody? That's a super humble place to be. This guy knows who he's before, and he says, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will. Be clean. And immediately the man was cleansed. So some of you are familiar with this story, and you know that there's a backstory to it. The fact that Jesus touches the man, there's a story within this story. Because, of course, back in the day, the thing about leprosy is that, well, it was very dehumanizing. they didn't experience human touch. In Jesus' day, it was believed that you could contract leprosy by touching someone. And so when Jesus touches the man, Jesus could have said, he could have from a distance said, be healed. But instead he reaches out and touches the man and says, I will be clean. The fact that Jesus touches him is an act that humanizes him. It's an act that brings a guy that hasn't been touched in a long time that quality of humanity that God instilled into every one of us that he didn't have. So it goes beyond. See, do you understand what compassion does for me? There's layers to it. It's a physical need, but it's also this sense that I'm valued. I'm important. I matter. And this is much deeper than you even understand, because just before this incident, Jesus gives the greatest sermon of all time, the best sermon ever, called the Sermon on the Mount. And you know what Jesus says there? He says, don't think that I came to abolish the law. I came to fulfill it. That's kind of a curious thing. What does he mean by that? Don't think I came to abolish the law. The Old Testament law that Moses received and handed down. He says, now I didn't come to abolish that. Why would he even make that statement? That's such a strange thing to say. And then what does he do just after that? He touches a leper. Guess what's included in Old Testament law? A restriction on touching people with skin diseases. What? You see what Jesus, the compassion of Jesus by touching man tells a story. And the story is this. Jesus actually, Matthew's audience, they're Jewish. So when they're reading these stories about Jesus touching a leper, they're like, whoa, oh, we see what's going on. They understand Leviticus chapter 13 and 14, which tells them, even if you happen to touch a leper, then what that's requiring is for you to go through the ceremonial cleansing process. Even if you accidentally touch someone with a skin disease, then you have to go through a ceremonial process. There's no indication in the text that Jesus does any of that. And so what he does is he sets aside the letter of the law to pursue the spirit of the law. That's what compassion does. And what happens to the religious people that are in the crowd? Instead of saying, wow, what a lesson to learn. Wow, the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law leads to this. The man is healed, but he's got dignity. He's got so much more. And the way that he healed him, instead they say, we have a problem with Jesus because he broke the rules. He broke the rules, and so further evidence that he doesn't come from God. They should have said, wow, he healed somebody. See, they had an understanding that no one can heal except for by God. So that's why later on they'll say, oh, your power comes from Satan. They couldn't deny his power, but the way he did it, they completely missed it. Jesus is telling a story. Watch what I do. I'm going to touch him. I'm going to touch this man. Y'all watching? Y'all watching? Be clean. People were not supposed to touch lepers because they thought the disease would spread. And so Jesus touches the leper so that the cure can spread. And that cure is compassion. So I want to encourage you, Illuminate. We partner with a lot of different organizations that I guess in the world's eyes would consider them the least of these, but not for us. We work with House of Refuge, Teen Challenge, D2L, and God is working in the midst of all of these people, and they have their stories. And by the way, you have your story. And what we're told is that when we partner with these people and they're around the Illuminate community, what I hear, and I'm so happy about it, it's like a pride. It's like a godly pride, okay? They're saying, we feel embraced. We don't get treated any differently. We come, people want to hear our stories. They talk to us. They embrace us. That's exactly how it should be. And in many places, the problem is they don't want to hear the voices of marginalized people. This is nothing new. It was true in Jesus' day. Back to Matthew chapter 20 and verse 31. So the crowd rebuked the blind men, telling them to be silent. Hey, shut up. Don't you know who this is? This is Jesus. He's the Son of God. Have you not heard? He's very busy. Don't bother him right now. So they cried out all the more, which is what people do when they're suffering and they're not being heard. They cry out even more. Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David. There's a principle here. If you're going to show compassion to someone, you have to first listen. You have to listen to the cries that are around you. And they are around you. And you don't have to visit the dump in Guatemala City to hear the cries. People are crying out all the time. Have you ever been in an office meeting or a business meeting, and all of a sudden the temperature in the room just kind of goes up because there's strife or discord between a group of people, maybe even two individuals? And one person is saying something and another person, and then all of a sudden the next thing you know, and it becomes really awkward for everybody else in the room. You know what I think is really going on there? People aren't being heard. You know, it's like, are you listening to me? Are you hearing what I'm saying? See, there are so many opportunities for us to step into those moments and be salve and display compassion. In Philippians, Paul says, don't just look out for your own interests, but consider the interests of others. So first we have to stop, we have to listen, and be attentive. Now notice what Jesus does next. And stopping. So I don't know how many hundreds of people, quite possibly thousands of people are with Jesus. Right? He's got his own entourage of the disciples. His popularity is, he's huge, you know. I mean, he's an ancient celebrity of his time. And so he's got all these people following him. Here are these two marginalized people that nobody ever pays any attention to, and they're crying out to Jesus, and people are telling them to shut up, and Jesus says, I'm stopping. I heard their cries, and now I'm stopping. I'm actually paying attention to what they have to say. How many times, do you and I, not a guilt trip, it's just the truth, right? And I don't want to say you, I'll say me. How many times do I just keep going? Aware of the cries, I hear them, but I don't stop. Don't have time for that. Furthermore, Jesus engages, he acts. Jesus called them and said, what do you want me to do for you? Now again, you're in this crowd. And people like Jesus don't take time for things like this. Right? Important people just don't stop. And so here's this whole crowd, the entourage, all the people, and everything just stops. And Jesus turns to them and says, what do you want me to do for you? They said to him, Lord, let our eyes be open. And Jesus, in pity, touched their eyes. And immediately they recovered their sight. Best part, and they followed him. Now, you read that word pity, and that's one way to translate this word, and that's okay. But let me just give you the Greek word for it because it's super rich. The Greek word, and excuse me if I'm pronouncing this not exactly correctly, but splonknistes. Splonknistes. You say, what does that mean? It's a really interesting word. It's actually very rich. So the ancient Greeks had a way of describing body parts, internal body parts. And there are two classifications: noble body parts and less noble body parts. Noble body parts had to do with the heart, the lungs, the kidney, the liver. Those were noble body parts. Lesser noble body parts were the intestines and the bowels. This word describes the noble body parts, the heart. So let's read it that way. And Jesus, in his noble body parts, his heart, his lungs, his chest. You ever experience something and you just feel it right here? You just feel it in your chest and you're moved. That's what happened to Jesus. And what does Jesus do? He touches them. See that? Compassion restores the soul. Have you ever been treated as less than human? Have you ever been dehumanized in front of people? I mean, for these men in this moment, it was the greatest moment of their lives, not just because they received their sight back, because of what compassion bestowed upon them. So, have you ever been treated less than human? My friend in college, his dad managed a local radio station. And so he would get concert tickets, free concert tickets. And so my friend called me, there's this super popular band coming in town that we love. And my friend said, hey, my dad can get us tickets. Not only can he get us tickets, but he's got backstage passes. So I'm like, I'm totally down for that. Let's go. So we go to this concert. Concert was amazing. And then with our backstage passes, we met a security guard, and we go into this little room. And in this room, there's maybe 15, 20 people. And I'm super excited, more excited than I am nervous, until the door opens and the band walks in. And I happen to be standing right next to the door. So as he opens the door, I kind of have to get out of the way in order for the door to open. And so myself and the lead singer, we're right next to each other. And then I become kind of nervous. And so I'm like, I stick out my hand, like to shake his hand, you know. It's like, great show. And he looks at me and he pauses and he says, wait a minute. And he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out a rubber glove and puts it on his hand. And then he proceeds to shake my hand. And I'm like, what, why, am I untouchable? Are you like so far above me that you can't just shake my hand? You understand how it goes? What happened there? Dehumanizing. Being treated less than humanly. Being robbed of the human dignity that God created within all of us. I won't mention the band. It's a very popular band. There's only 2 letters in the name, and one is a letter, but the other is a number. But anyways. The people that society dehumanized, Jesus humanized, constantly humanizing people through compassion. See, what's our attitude toward the least of these? Looking beyond the physical, meeting the needs of their soul and the way that God created them. One of my favorite stories from Jesus, the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's one of my favorites because, you know, of the way Jesus frames everything. He's so good. Jesus makes a hero out of an anti-hero. So an expert in the law asked Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? You know, great idea, or a great question. He's an expert in the law. So Jesus, retaining his own authority, because that's what you did as a rabbi, you don't answer questions directly, you use the Socratic method. You want the student to understand. And so he says, well, you're an expert in the law. What does it say? And the guy says, well, love God and love your neighbor. Yep, you said it right. Do this and you will live. And then the guy says, but wait a minute. Who is my neighbor? And Jesus doesn't answer directly. He says, well, let me tell you a story. There's a story about these 3 people. This guy's traveling down the road and he gets robbed. He gets beat up, man. He's like half dead, stripped naked. And he's just there, dying. And along the same road walks a priest. The priest sees him and walks on the other side of the road to avoid him. Levite walks up. By the way, priest and a Levite, what's he describing? 2 religious people. Levite walks up and sees him. He's like, he also walks around him. And then there's a Samaritan. And then when the words Samaritan come out of Jesus' mouth, the crowd is like, a Samaritan? Because to a priest and a Levite, a Samaritan was a half-bred Jew and therefore dirty. Right? The Bible says that the Jews had nothing to do with Samaritans. They didn't like each other. They didn't play well together at all. And so then Jesus takes a Samaritan and says, yeah, and then a Samaritan walks by, sees the guy, picks him up, takes him to the hospital, pays for his hospital bill. Anything the guy owes, he's going to pay for on his own credit. Now, who was his neighbor? Well, isn't it interesting that Jesus says the religious guys passed him by? Why? It goes back to the thinking of the day. What this person clearly did something to bring this on himself, so too bad for you. Dietrich Bonhoeffer says it so well. We must learn to regard people less in the light of what they do or omit to do, and more in the light of what they suffer. I love this quote because it reminds me of the way in which God treats me. Right? He didn't look at me and say, Jason's a pretty good dude, therefore I will be good to him. He's like, Jason's a wreck. I'm going to be compassionate towards him. So, quickly, what does it take to be compassionate? We have to listen, we have to stop, and we have to act. So, practically speaking, here's what the Bible says. Proverbs 31, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. In other words, Christians must use their voice. We must speak up. Certainly the unborn children are a part of this. Those who are impoverished, those who are poor, those who are marginalized. Certainly that's our voice. Having said that, let's be quick to understand this. The tone of our voice is very important. That's why here at Illuminate, not only are we careful about who we partnership, but we're also very careful with the tone of the voices that are going forth in those organizations. Because we will always be in the battle. The battle will never end without the gospel being presented. And we want them to receive and hear the gospel. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. It can be argued, I think, that that compassion is actually a justice issue. And I say that because in Job, if you know the story of Job, he gets everything taken away from him. And then he makes this statement, he's saying to God, I could understand the mistreatment if I had turned my back on the poor, if I had rejected the fatherless. But no, I didn't. I fed the poor. They ate at my own table. I was a father to the fatherless. I can see this happening, this coming into my life. If I acted unjustly, if I withheld compassion towards others, then I could see this coming into my life. So I think in a sense, compassion is a justice issue. 1 John, dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. It's not enough just to say, you know what, brother, I'm going to pray for you. I'll pray for you. How do we move just beyond the words? That's important. Obviously, prayer is important, but it's the actions that display the compassion tangibly. 1 Peter 4, each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. So isn't this great? Not only did God put you on this planet to be a blessing to others, but he actually gifted you in specific ways to be compassionate, to display compassion. Zechariah chapter 7, this is what the Lord Almighty said, administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor. Do not plot evil against each other. James will go on to say, pure and undefiled religion is to help those who cannot help you, the orphan, the widow, the foreigner. It's pure and undefiled because if I help you and you have the means to help me, my motivation could be wrong. I'm helping you just so you'll help me, so I can get something from you. But when you help an orphan, a widow, or a foreigner, there's nothing they can do for you in return. Philippians 2, therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any comfort sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. It's interesting, right? In the church, we actually show compassion toward one another by being unified in the way we think and in the way we act. What does that mean? It means love covers a multitude of sins. It means that we don't take mountains and molehills and turn them into mountains. And especially it means this. We don't allow, you've heard me say it this way before, our preferences to become our prejudices. Once our preferences become our prejudices, we're done. And that is the absolute death of compassion toward one another. And then there's this, Ephesians 4, and we'll end. Be kind and compassionate to one another. How? Forgive each other. Forgive each other. Why would I want to do that? Just as in Christ, God has forgiven you. Wow. You withhold forgiveness from others, you've totally forgotten the gospel message. Forgiveness is that salve of compassion. Jesus' very presence in the world was the ultimate act of compassion. Christian, why would you want to withhold that? What excuse could you possibly have? So here's what we're going to do. Not what we're going to say. Here's what we're going to do. As you leave this morning, in the parking lot, there's some shoe boxes. And we're going to take a shoe box. If you have kids, by the way, pick up one for each of your kids. You could probably fill a shoe box for what, 15 or 20 bucks. Basic hygiene items, things that bestow dignity on kids. that need it in the name of Jesus Christ. If you have kids, pick up a box for each one of your kids. This is a great sort of little entry level way to heighten their awareness of what's around them and how to meet those needs. And then we're going to bring them back, and then they'll be delivered to the kids who are in need. So, at this church, we're not just going to talk about it. We will act on it. And the reality is this is just a small thing, but this is where it starts. And the prayer is that it would continue to grow. So, Father, our desire this morning is that you would refresh us with the gospel first and foremost, because it all flows from what Jesus did for us on the cross. And just to think that we are his joy, and that in some sense, the joy of Jesus could not be complete unless we had the opportunity to enter into that joy. And for that, he had to make a sacrifice. Father, he's our example and our model in all things. I'm so grateful for the compassion of this community toward me, my family, toward each other. God, protect us from the powers of darkness that love to rob us of our love for you and for each other. We ask it all in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, and God's people said, amen.